Today, I have the honor of introducing our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Pellicer Sanchez. Dr. Pellicer Sanchez holds an MA and PhD in Applied Linguistics from the University of Nottingham in the UK, where she completed her PhD research in vocabulary acquisition and processing. She also has held positions as teaching associate in bilingualism and language learning, and as an assistant professor in applied linguistics at the University of Nottingham. She came to the UCL Institute of Education to start a role as associate professor of applied linguistics in TESOL in 2017. During her incredible career, Dr. Pellicer Sanchez has used psycholinguistic techniques of reaction time and eye tracking to study vocabulary learning with a focus on learning from reading and examining the effectiveness of different teaching and learning methods for improving learners' declarative and procedural knowledge. Recently, she has examined second language learners' acquisition of single and multi-word units from reading using eye tracking. Using eye tracking, she also examines the L2 learning process and how learners' engagement with various different sources of input in multimodal materials. Dr. Pellicer Sanchez has also published her work in various peer-reviewed and top-tier journals such as Studies in Second Language Acquisition, Second Language Research, Language Teaching Research, and Language Testing. Today, she will discuss the use of eye tracking to examine the effect of instructional interventions on vocabulary learning from reading. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Pellicer Sanchez.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for great introduction, Steve. So let me just share my screen so that I can.
We're going to give you permission to share
in just a second. Do.
You should be good now. Can you do it now?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Let me see if I can put it here. Can you see my slides now? Yes, can you see them? And still see me? Perfect. Great. It's great to see you as a group there. And also Aline, I can see everyone in the screen. So that's great. Again, thanks so much, Aline, for the invitation to be here today. It is really a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to.
Anna, we can see your speaker view.
Sorry?
We see the notes that you have. Like we see.
Okay, let me see.
Yeah. I think if you click the one that's dotted, maybe.
You know what?
Okay, I think display settings at the top, maybe. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, because I have two screens and I think they're in the other way.
There we go. Perfect.
Perfect. And I can still see you here. Excellent. Yeah. Yeah, it was just mixed up with the two screens. Yeah, so as I was saying, really, it is great for me to be here. It's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to share some of the things that I've done in relation with eye tracking studies, and it's always a never-ending learning process. And so I always learn from these opportunities and these discussions. So it's also really good for me as well. So what I'm going to do today, as you know, so I'm going to be talking about the use of eye tracking to examine the effect of instructional interventions on vocabulary learning from reading. So really the idea is to see how, and this is what we wanted to do with the studies I'm going to be talking about today, how we can use eye tracking in the context of instructed second language acquisition, and particularly focusing on vocabulary learning. So the two papers you had to read and the studies that I'm going to be talking about today are coming from a study that I conducted with my colleagues Kathy Conkling and Laura Wilkaite. I believe you will hear from Kathy too soon. And these are two papers that was one study that we conducted to investigate the effect of pre-reading instruction on vocabulary learning from reading. And we kind of follow up. It was an initial study, the one that you've read in language learning, and then we followed that up with a secondary analysis of the same data set, but with different, a slightly different purpose. And I wanted to talk about these two studies, basically to show how one kind of led to the other and how the second one should lead to others as well, and the kind of issues that we should still address. So that's the plan for this session. There will be time at the end for questions, I believe. So yeah, if you have any questions, please do keep them for the end. So let's start with a bit of background to this study. We all agree on the importance of vocabulary for successful communication. We know that it's an important component of language proficiency. Learners, second language and foreign language learners need to acquire a large vocabulary size for successful communication. And this is indeed a topic that has received a lot of attention from vocabulary researchers. So we have a study showing that in order to reach successful comprehension of a range of written or spoken discourse, learners really need to know around 6,000 to 7,000 or 8,000 to 9,000 word families, respectively. Now, these figures could be discussed for, you know, we could spend another 1 or 2 hours talking about these vocabulary learning targets and this idea of vocabulary requirements. But the idea for us today here is really just to remember that in order to reach successful communication, second language learners need to have huge vocabulary sizes. So they do need to learn loads of words and loads of word families. So an important concern of vocabulary researchers has really been to try to find the most effective ways to actually help learners in achieving these targets. So when we talk about vocabulary learning and these different approaches that we can use to support learners, we basically distinguish two main approaches or teaching or learning approaches. We make a distinction usually between more deliberate intentional learning and more incidental learning. As you probably know, deliberate intentional learning has been defined as the type of learning where we focus attention directly on the information to be learned. So learners, there is a clear intention to learn vocabulary. Learners actually have that particular intention, and we complete a set of vocabulary activities, for example, with the particular purpose of learning vocabulary. That would be a more intentional or deliberate learning condition. Incidental learning, on the other hand, is the type of learning that occurs when one is using the language for communicative purposes. So many different definitions, as you know, have been suggested. One of them involving the lack of test announcements. So usually in studies on incidental learning, learners do not know that there is going to be a vocabulary test afterwards, and no explicit focus on lexical items. So the focus is usually on understanding the input. The focus is on meaning, really understanding the input that learners are exposed to, rather than learning vocabulary. So when we talk about incidental learning, we're really talking about learning from reading while listening, from listening or from viewing as well, with quite a lot of studies looking at learning from viewing recently. And we have plenty of evidence to show that this happens and it's possible. Most of the studies, these are just some references, most of the studies have been conducted in the context of reading. Loads of studies with reading, not so much with listening, but we do still have a few studies showing that incidental learning of vocabulary from listening happens, also from reading while listening. And as I was saying, most recently from quite a few studies looking at incidental learning from viewing. And the studies that I'm going to talk about today are placed within this context of learning, vocabulary learning from reading. So the kind of methodology traditionally used in these studies on incidental vocabulary learning from reading involved mainly the use of vocabulary pre-tests, where we assess knowledge of a set of vocabulary items before a particular reading activity, usually addressing different components of vocabulary knowledge. Then that is followed by a reading activity where learners are exposed to the novel vocabulary in a text. And then that's followed by vocabulary post-test, either immediate or delayed, depending on the design. So with this kind of methodology and design, we've really managed to get a lot of information and improve our understanding of what happens the type of vocabulary that learners can acquire from reading, the different components that can be acquired, how they develop, or what aspects of vocabulary they develop incidentally from reading. And that's great. And I think we've basically obtained a lot of information and gained a lot of information and a lot of a better understanding of the type of vocabulary that happens from reading, what learners remember after a reading activity, what they're able to remember about novel vocabulary that they've been exposed to. But of course, this type of design doesn't really tell us much about what happens when learners are reading a text and they find words they don't know. How do they process those words, or how that is related to learning gains? And this is really where eye tracking comes into play and can really help us to get a better understanding of what happens while learners are actually reading and they encounter this novel vocabulary. So in recognition of these benefits, of course, a few studies were conducted to explore using eye tracking to explore the processing of novel items and the learning of those items in reading. A few studies in the first language context were conducted, and from these studies we seem to see that, as expected, new words attract and receive longer reading times. So L1 readers pay more attention to novel words. That's what we would expect, right? And we also see in the studies that familiarity with words is an important factor. So we see shorter reading times for more familiar words. And also the study by Joseph et al. In 2014 also showed that reading times tended to decrease with exposures. So as numbers of exposures increased, reading times tended to decrease, obviously, probably due to an increased familiarity with those items. So this is what we had from the first language context initially. And in the second language context, of course, researchers started to again, in recognition of these benefits, use eye tracking to explore vocabulary learning from reading. To my knowledge, the first study in this area was the study by Gottfried, Boers and Hausen in 2013, where they looked at the processing and learning of pseudowords in sentence contexts. And they were able to see that participants were able to recognize 23% of the pseudowords after only just one exposure in reading, but also they exploring the processing of those pseudowords in context, and they found that longer fixations on pseudowords than on words that participants knew very well. And they were also able to show a relationship between reading times and post-test recognition. So the amount of time people spent processing these pseudowords was related to the ability to then recognize those forms in post-tests. And following this line of research, this is really how I started using eye tracking. That was my first eye tracking study. And I wanted to see how that processing changed throughout repetitions in reading. So I conducted this initial study with both first and second language learners. And basically they had to read a text with pseudowords repeated several times. And then they completed several vocabulary tests. So just to give you like a kind of general finding overview and of the pattern that we found initially, as suspected, participants were spending more time, both L1 and L2 readers, processing words that they didn't know. So those novel items in the first exposure, they spent longer time than processing those words that they knew very well. And then there was a clear pattern of decrease, as we had seen in the first language context. So kind of confirming those patterns. So quite a few studies have followed in the second language context. I think recently we've had quite a few studies using eye tracking to continue exploring the development and the processing of novel vocabulary from reading and how that is actually related to learning gains. So overall, what do we see from this research? Well, first of all, we see that we see longer reading times for unknown vocabulary. So that's a pattern that we see across the studies. Reading times decrease with subsequent exposures. We've also seen similar patterns of processing throughout exposures for both single words and formulaic sequences. We've also seen that context predictability affects reading times, and also that reading times on unknown words are related to post-test vocabulary gains. This is not something that we've seen in all the studies, but in many of the studies conducted, and that's something else to discuss later if you wish. So the interesting thing, I think, is that we found these kind of general patterns of, initial longer fixation, a significant decrease throughout exposures. We found that pattern in studies that have used very different materials. So we have studies using graded readers, others using authentic and modified materials. The type of items that we've looked at are also very different. So we have pseudo words in some studies, foreign language words in others, low frequency real words in other studies, even collocations in other studies. So, but the kind of general patterns that studies have reported seem to be pretty consistent, and I think that shows kind of that they're robust. So we are finding this kind of same general pattern in studies using different types of materials. So far so good, but we know that when we talk about incidental vocabulary learning and learning and the development of knowledge of novel items from reading, it really depends on many different things. There are many different factors that affect how successful learners are in learning new words from reading. And we also know that in many studies, the gains reported are very small, very modest. They exist, they're there, but they tend to be modest gains. So one of the factors that has been claimed to really affect the rate of success in vocabulary learning from reading is the degree of involvement in processing unknown words. So we have vocabulary researchers claiming that the degree of attention, engagement, involvement is key in vocabulary learning. We need to ensure that the learners are engaged and pay attention to the vocabulary items that they don't know. And this is, of course, supported by the depth of processing hypothesis. So we know that learners need to notice the lexical items in the input. But we also have researchers claiming that learners do not always notice those items in the input, right? Or that they might not actually process them in a way that is conducive to learning. I think that is quite interesting. So an important question and concern, I think, in the literature in this area has been to basically find out how we can help learners to actually notice those linguistic forms, in our case, those novel words that they don't know in the input. How can we make novel vocabulary more salient in the input for learners, with the idea that making them more salient would lead to more attention, and that would lead to better gains. That's the kind of idea behind these, and that's what we would hope to find. So there are in the literature many different methods, right, that have been used to increase the salience of target vocabulary. Many different techniques have been investigated. We know that one of the techniques that has received the most attention probably is the pre-modification of input, so input enhancement techniques. So having specific words in bold or underlined or highlighted, or sometimes modifying the intonation to make them more salient. So these different input enhancement techniques have been investigated to see whether they actually support and lead to better vocabulary gains. In eye tracking research, there is one study that actually used eye tracking to explore how input enhancement techniques actually affected the processing of novel items from reading. This study by Choi was conducted in the context of learning collocations. So what the focus was really on the role of textual enhancement. So they compared the processing and learning of collocations that were enhanced versus unenhanced collocations. And they found longer reading times and more fixations on novel items, as we've seen in all the other studies that I've mentioned. So again, that's kind of a common pattern. And interestingly, longer total reading times and more fixations in the enhanced conditions. So they were able to show with eye tracking that actually textual enhancement does lead to increased attention. So we see that the effect of textual enhancement reflected in longer reading times with this eye tracking study. So input enhancement is one of those techniques that has received a lot of attention. Another one is the use of in-text glosses. So the idea with using glosses is that they support the reading process, but they also lead to some sort of differences in attention. So one of the I would say quite a few recent studies have actually used eye tracking to explore the effect that different types of glosses have on the processing of both the glosses and the words in the text. So as we know, there are many different types of glosses, and many of them have been investigated with eye tracking, and they have actually shown clear differences in attention allocation to the words in the text. So the general idea with glosses is that they make that novel vocabulary more salient. But without these eye tracking studies, we really didn't know much about how that affected attention to the words in the text or attention to the glosses as well. So what we've seen in these recent studies is that first language glosses tend to lead to less attention to in-text words when compared to non-glosses. Interactive glosses also lead to more attention to in-text words when compared to non-interactive glosses, and picture-only glosses also seem to lead to the least attention. So we have a better idea of how, or we have some idea of how these different types of glosses actually lead to differences in attention allocation. Interestingly, some recent studies have shown no differences at all in the processing of in-text words in different types of glosses, L1, L2, and no glosses conditions. So this clearly shows that more research is needed in this area. And some studies have also shown a positive relationship between attention to words and glosses with vocabulary gains. So this is another of these attention drawing techniques that has been investigated within the eye tracking vocabulary learning literature. And the one technique or approach that I'm going to focus on today is this idea of instructional intervention before reading. I mean, for those of you with teaching experience or with your experience as learners, we all know that this is a common approach in a classroom. So very often we teach a set of words that are going to appear in a later in a reading activity, and we feel that learners might not know them or they're crucial to understand the story. So we teach a set of words first, and then learners continue with the reading activity where those words actually appear. So the idea with this instructional intervention before reading is that vocabulary is initially learned through explicit and intentional learning, and then knowledge is consolidated with those exposures in reading. So the idea is that we establish some initial form meaning link and knowledge of the form meaning link in the first activity or activities, and then the exposures in reading help to consolidate that knowledge and kind of contribute to expand knowledge of those items. So researchers have claimed that these actually support success in lexical inferencing from reading. So it makes lexical inferencing more successful, and it kind of avoids those, or to a certain extent, limits the potential incorrect inferences from guessing. As we know in reading studies, that's also very common, that learners might make incorrect inferences. So if we add instructional intervention before reading, we might limit or get rid of those incorrect inferences. And we do have some empirical evidence. We don't have loads and loads of studies, but we have some empirical evidence actually showing that it has a positive effect on vocabulary gains, that actually adding that instructional intervention, not surprisingly, leads to larger vocabulary gains. So, but really what made me really start with this study and what really got my attention was some of the claims that were made around the effects of instructional intervention before reading. So in some cases, we had researchers saying, well, this increases salience of the vocabulary items and cognitive processing of the words. So it would lead to more attention and more, increased cognitive processing. But then we had other claims saying, well, it might actually discourage guessing strategies, affecting and possibly negatively affecting the learning process. So if we think about these two potential hypotheses, I mean, one would point to increased attention when learners actually encounter those recently taught words in a text, and the other hypothesis would really point towards less attention, right? So if guessing strategies are discouraged, we would hypothesize that learners are processing those, spend less time processing those novel words. So we had kind of hypotheses going in different directions, and I was really intrigued by this and thinking, well, this is really an area where eye tracking can actually help. So we can really see whether instructional intervention before reading actually leads to more or less attention to the novel items in a text than when we have, a condition where there has been no instructional intervention before reading. So this is really how we started with the study that I'm presenting today. So what we really wanted to know was basically whether pre-reading instruction led to larger gains than reading only and instruction only conditions. What is the effect of pre-reading instruction on the online processing of newly learned vocabulary? So basically the effect of pre-reading instruction on both vocabulary gains and the processing of those words when compared to the different, the other conditions like reading only and instruction only, and whether there was a relationship between online processing patterns and learning gains. So I'll get into more details later, but just so that we have an overall, and you've read the paper, so you have an overall, but just to confirm, overall idea of what we did, the different groups that we compared. So we had a pre-reading instruction condition where participants completed some vocabulary activities, and then they read a text which contained those novel words. We had a reading only condition where there was no instruction, but they just read a text with those novel words. Instruction only condition, where participants only completed the vocabulary activities, and then the reading baseline condition, where participants read the same text, but instead of novel words, pseudo words, we use control words, so very high frequency words that everybody would be familiar with. So these are I'll get into more, I'll explain these different conditions in more detail in a minute. So, as for the participants of the study, we conducted this study with both L1 and L2 readers, L1 and L2 speakers of English. L1 English speakers were undergraduate students at a British university, and we measured their vocabulary size as well with an average of around 8,600 words. L2 learners of English were advanced users of English. They were all students at a British university. Most of them were postgraduate students, with a few of them being undergraduate students. They were from a range of L1 backgrounds. And again, we also measured the vocabulary size and ensured that there were no differences in their vocabulary size across conditions. And we did the same with self-rating, so they had to rate their proficiency in speaking, listening, and reading. And we also ensured that there were no differences across conditions. I think initially in the analysis, we included both vocabulary size and self-ratings as potential variables, but then they were highly obviously correlated, and we just included vocabulary size. in the report. So these are the participants that participated in the study. As for the reading text, we use a short story that I had used and developed for that initial study that I mentioned. So it's a short narrative story, around 2,290 words. And it contains 6 pseudo words repeated 8 times. The reason why I used this initial study was not because I actually loved the story, because by that point I had seen it so many times and I had read it so many times that, believe me, I was ready for a change. But the reason was that we had spent quite a lot of time piloting that initial story, and we had controlled for as much as possible the presence of contextual cues. So we had done a bit of piloting to ensure that all contexts were more or less equally informative. We controlled for the difficulty of the vocabulary, the position of the target items. So this is really one of the reasons, one of the main reasons why we use that initial story. We created a control condition. So for that reading baseline condition, we use the same story, but just replace pseudo words with high frequency words. We check the vocabulary profile, so knowledge of the first 4,000 most frequent words in English provided a coverage of a coverage of 98%. Again, this is a topic that I like very much, and I could be talking about lexical coverage for another 2 hours, but we'll leave it like that. If you're interested, we can discuss that later. But the point for this was that, all the words in the story were high frequency, and our learners, second language learners, were advanced users of English. So we could assume that the story was easy for them and they were not finding any particular difficulties. The story was divided across different trials. In the eye tracking experiment, there were 25 trials or pages in the story. So it was a continuous narrative text. And we also use a true-false comprehension test that was used in the initial study. The focus of this study wasn't really to explore comprehension, but we needed even a brief comprehension measure just to ensure that participants were paying attention to what they were reading and they were actually completing the task. This is the reason why we included it. And just to give you an idea, this is an example of how the text looked in the screen. So there was a maximum of 8 lines, and we control for the position of the items, as I was saying, never at the beginning or end of a sentence. And I think the maximum of items in the same screen was 2 pseudo words in the same trial. So as for the target items, we took them from a different study, also because they had been piloted quite extensively. So pseudo words were initially created from the ARC non-word database and controlling for a number of factors like length and neighborhood size, number of phonological neighbors, number of body neighbors. So, and also we did quite a lot of piloting, and there were 2 main things that we try to do in the piloting of these pseudo words. First of all, we rate them. We ask a group of participants to rate them according to how likely the pseudo words were actually plausible forms in English. That's what we want with pseudo words, right? When we are using pseudo words in a vocabulary learning study, we want them to look like real words. We don't want participants to think, oh, these are invented words, or, these look really, really fake. So, that part of the piloting was really important. Then the other thing we did with another group of participants was to examine and rate the items that we had selected according to how likely the connection between form and meaning was. So basically, we didn't want the form to reveal, we tried to do that when we selected the items, but we wanted to confirm that the form actually didn't really reveal the meaning of the item. And, sometimes, you might have learners saying, oh, I know the meaning of that word because it really reminds me of, the actual meaning, or is similar to this word with the other meaning. So we really wanted to, make sure that the form in itself wasn't giving away the meaning of the item. So the target items were taken from this study, and following those stages of piloting. We needed some activities for that pre-reading instruction condition, for that instructional intervention. And we tried to, since this was the first investigation and the first study that we were conducting in this area, we decided to keep it simple and just start with a presentation of items with their definitions. And we asked them to go through the list and try to memorize, try to remember, try to learn the connections between the form and the meanings. We thought about leaving it there, but we were thinking that, of course, if we just do that, we don't really know whether participants actually successfully created that form meaning link. So we decided to add a second matching activity where we presented again definitions and items, but in a different order, and they had to match the form with the meaning. An important detail is that we actually asked them that if they didn't remember for some reason, they could basically turn the page and check the definitions again. That was an important methodological decision. I don't think we had that much space in the paper to actually explain that. And this was something that we thought about for a while, but we really wanted to ensure that all participants had successfully created that form meaning link. It would have been super interesting to actually see what happens when participants don't actually create that form meaning link, or they make mistakes in this second matching activity. But that would have added another level of another variable to the study, and would have another kind of question that we didn't really want to address in this study. So in order to ensure that they had all actually created successfully that form meaning link, we asked them to check if you don't remember, and just to make sure that you got it right. So these are the two activities that we use for the instruction only and the pre-reading instruction conditions. So as for the assessment instruments, as I was saying earlier, we used the reading comprehension test from the original study, short test, just to ensure that they were following and reading and understanding what they were reading. Then we used 3 vocabulary tests. The first one was a form recognition test. It was a spelling test, really. So we presented the target item and 3 different options. And they had to select the one that they thought was the correct form of the target items that they had seen. Meaning recall, basically we show them the items again. Remember, there were only 6 items. So we show them the items and we asked them to explain anything they remember about the meaning of those items. Yes, we asked them to provide anything, could be a synonym, a definition in English, however they wanted to explain the meaning. And then the meaning recognition test included different options for the meaning of the target item. So it was the correct option and 3 distractors that were semantically related to the content of the story to make them plausible options. So I was already introducing the different conditions that we looked at. So we had a pre-reading instruction condition where participants completed vocabulary activities followed by the reading of the text containing the pseudo words, and then they completed the vocabulary tests. So they were immediate vocabulary tests. The reading only condition, no instruction, just reading the text with pseudo words followed by vocabulary tests. A reading baseline condition, where participants read the same text but with controlled real words instead of pseudo words, and then an instruction only condition where participants completed the initial vocabulary activities, then did some unrelated readings just to keep the time the same, and then they completed the vocabulary tests. So when we looked at vocabulary gains, so in response to the first research question, we were comparing gains from pre-reading instruction, reading only, and instruction only. So because these were the conditions where there were pseudo words involved and they completed the vocabulary tests. When looking at the eye movement patterns and the processing of novel words, we compare these three conditions, basically the ones that involve the reading of the text with pseudo words. So obviously there was no reading of these pseudo words in the instruction only condition. So as for the equipment, we use iLink 1000+. The text was presented in Courier New Font, size 18, double spacing. We had drift correction and 9-point calibration and validation procedure. We collected the data in head stabilized mode. So we used a head and chin rest to minimize eye movements. We also, did monocular recording. And that was important. We also added at the beginning a practice a session. So it was a very short session, but it was very similar to the actual experimental session. So it included only 5 trials, so 5 pages, so a very short story. And some, I think it was 8 or even 5 comprehension questions. So we didn't really care about performance with these, but it was really important to make sure the participants were basically got used to the procedure and how it worked. And an important detail was that the practice session, the practice text also included some pseudo words, because we didn't want it to be such a surprise, when they were reading the experimental text. So we tried to make it as similar as possible. So by the time they actually started reading the experimental text, they were, used to not only the procedure, but, reading text of this sort. So in terms of the analysis, we checked first the comprehension questions and to make sure that they all actually understood what they were reading, and they all had higher scores, with slightly higher in the second language group. The experimental data were analyzed using R. In order to, I'll get into more detail later, but basically we did different things to explore the processing of the novel words throughout the different exposures. So growth curve analysis was used to examine how processing of the items changed throughout those 8 exposures. And then we also fitted linear mixed effects models to examine processing and specific encounters. So we'll see that in a minute. So in terms of the results, let's start with the offline measures. This was, I'm fully aware, it was a lengthy part, especially the online measures, lengthy part of the paper. So I've tried to identify and summarize the main patterns. So let's start with the offline measures. So we fitted mixed effects models, one separate model for each vocabulary test. So we had one for form recognition, meaning recognition, and meaning recall. So for form recognition, what we found was that there was no effect of groups. So L1 and L2 speakers performed very similarly. And there was a significant effect of condition and no interaction. So basically what we see for form recognition, which is the first that you have in these 2 graphs, was that there was an advantage of pre-reading instruction over reading only and instruction only. So clear, in terms of form recognition, clear advantage of pre-reading instruction condition. Then for meaning recognition, we did see an effect of group, with L1 speakers outperforming L2 participants. There was a significant effect of condition and no interaction. And the effect of condition showed that for meaning recognition, again, pre-reading instruction had an advantage over instruction only. And also there was a difference, significant difference between reading only and and instruction only. And something very similar we found for meaning recall. Again, L1 speakers scoring a little bit higher than L2 speakers, and a significant effect of condition, with pre-reading instruction performing better than instruction only. And also reading only being significantly different from instruction only. So overall, with the offline measures, with the vocabulary tests, what we find is that there is a clear kind of advantage of pre-reading instruction condition as expected. So that was no surprise. So participants in the pre-reading instruction condition did better, especially so better than the other 2 conditions in form recognition, and at least better than the instruction only in the other two vocabulary tests, so for meaning recognition and meaning recall. So overall, an advantage of pre-reading instruction. And it's interesting that it's kind of, so vocabulary gains from pre-reading instruction are kind of larger than what was already kind of learned from instruction only, but we'll get to that in the discussion. So in terms of the processing, so how were these novel words processed in the different conditions? Did really pre-reading instruction led to any differences? We look at different measures. Well, as you know, in eye tracking studies, we looked at many other measures, but then of course we couldn't report everything that we looked at in the paper, and we decided to report those more in line with previous studies and a combination of more early and late measures. So we looked at first fixation duration, first pass reading time, total reading time, and fixation count. The overall pattern, again, similar to what we had seen in previous studies, was that initially there was more attention to the novel items, and then there is a clear pattern of decrease. So in order to examine these decrease, we did different things. The first thing we did was to feed as I was saying earlier, we did a growth curve analysis to basically see how reading times actually changed throughout those 8 exposures. So we saw a different pattern for the different measures that we looked at, as you have in the figure here. For first fixation duration, we see a more linear decrease, whereas for first pass reading time, fixation count, and total reading time, the decrease is more is cubic. We also found interaction between condition and number of exposures. And that was key. So in order to further analyze this interaction, we fitted different models, separate models with total reading times for each condition. And basically the main thing for us to remember here is that we see a similar similar pattern for pre-reading instruction and reading only. So in this case, the decrease was curvilinear. So at the beginning, there was a kind of a steeper decrease. It leveled out a little bit, and then it continued decreasing. It was a little bit steeper for pre-reading instruction, but it was very similar to reading only condition. And in the case of the reading baseline condition, so where people were reading a text with high frequency control words, the models showed that the decrease was different, was linear. So in order to kind of further explore this interaction between condition and number of exposures, what we did was to fit separate models for different exposures. So we had seen initially that it looked like visually, the kind of more pronounced change was around the second or third exposure. So we decided to fit models for the first 3 exposures, but also for the last one. Again, we did actually fit models for every single exposure, but it was super lengthy already, and there wasn't that much of a change between 4 and 8. So these are the exposures that we decided to report in the paper. So we really wanted to keep exploring this interaction and see what happened at these different exposures, what potential differences really between the conditions at these different encounters. So let's see. Let's think about what happened at the first exposure. So the first time that people in these conditions encounter those novel pseudo words, those novel items. So at the first encounter, so what the models showed was basically, first of all, at the first encounter, no difference between L1 and L2. So there was no effect of language group. So L1 and L2 readers behaved in a very similar way. So what we find, as you can see here in the graphs, the pre-reading instruction, so participants in the pre-reading instruction and in the reading only condition spent longer time processing these items. This is just total reading time. So they spent longer total reading time when compared to participants in the control condition, who were obviously reading high frequency words. And that makes sense. So at the beginning, participants in the 2 experimental conditions, pre-reading and reading only, spent more time, longer total reading time processing these items. But there were no significant differences for any of the groups between pre-reading instruction or reading only. So the first time that people saw those items in the text, it didn't really matter, it didn't seem to matter whether they had actually received those vocabulary activities beforehand. They were processing those novel words in exactly the same or very similar way. In the second exposure, we start to see some differences across conditions. So again, here we don't find we didn't find a difference in terms of language groups. So no effect of language group. The behavior of L1 and L2 readers was very similar. But then we see that the pseudo words in the reading only condition were still read longer than the control words, but there was no difference between pre-reading instruction and reading only, and no difference between pre-reading instruction and control. So in this second exposure, the difference between pre-reading instruction and control seemed to disappear. But then in the third exposure, we see it again. From the third exposure really was where we started to see differences across language groups. So we saw a significant interaction between group and so language group L1 or L2 and condition. So what we found in this third exposure was that for the L1 speakers, there was already the differences across the three conditions disappear. So there were no differences across these three conditions. But for the L2 readers, there were some interesting differences. So still pre-reading instruction and reading only spent longer time than control words, than the control condition processing the target item. So no differences between pre-reading instruction and reading only, and both took longer than the control condition. And then at the last exposure in encounter number 8, what we saw was, again, an interaction between group and condition. In the case of L1 readers, no difference whatsoever. The pseudo words and the control words were all read in the same similar way in these three conditions. But in the case of L2 readers, we found interesting differences. So we saw that words in the pre-reading instruction conditions, so the pseudo words were read in a very similar way to control words. So in this case, the difference for L2 learners had disappeared, but pseudo words in the reading only condition were still taking longer time. So this is what we see, that perhaps what we are seeing here is an advantage of the pre-reading instruction condition over reading only. So we didn't see a difference initially when they encounter the words in the text in the first encounter, but towards the 8th encounter, actually we see a difference, an advantage of pre-reading instruction, with participants already reading those novel words in a way very similar to control words, but this is not what we find with reading only. So reading only condition is still needed some longer time processing those items. So for the last research question, we wanted to see whether there was a relationship between the processing patterns and the actual learning gains. So we looked at cumulative reading times, so the total reading times across all 8 exposures, following what other previous studies had done in this area. So we fit mixed effects models with vocabulary tests as the outcome variable and reading times, and participant group as predictors. And the results show that it was only in meaning recognition that cumulative reading times were a significant predictor of vocabulary gains. So they didn't predict vocabulary scores for form recognition and meaning recall, but they did for meaning recognition. So longer time on the pseudo words was related to better performance in meaning recognition, in the meaning recognition test. Okay, so what does all this kind of means? So with this study in relation to the first research question looking at vocabulary learning, what we saw was that pre-reading instruction led to larger vocabulary gains, not surprisingly, as was expected. It was in the case of form recognition, it had an advantage over reading only condition as well. And in the 3 measures that we use, it showed an advantage over instruction only. So this is important because it shows that the gains in a pre-reading instruction condition are not developed only during the initial activities. Actually, the extra exposures in reading add to that vocabulary knowledge and development, and support the development and strengthen that initial those initial representations from the initial activities. And this is really in line with Alice's exemplar-based account of second language acquisition. So we have the initial representations and then subsequent exposures reinforcing those initial representations. So, and it's also important to know that reading-only conditions also led to substantial gains. And in 2 of the 3 tests that we used, actually, there was no significant difference with pre-reading instruction. Again, not surprising because there were 6 items and repeated several times. So this was kind of expected and of course higher than what we would find in other studies, but it's still important to note. In terms of the processing, we saw a similar pattern of decrease in reading times in the reading-only and pre-reading instruction conditions. That's what we saw with the growth curve analysis. Reading patterns were characterized by initial rapid decrease from the first to third encounters, followed by a more gradual decrease, and this is in line with what we've seen in previous studies, also looking at this type of analysis. And as Godfrey et al. Claim, this decrease may reflect increasing familiarity and faster decoding of the novel items. Then looking at the kind of the rest of analysis in the when we look at the different exposures, looking at the online processing, what we found was that there was no overall, there was no evidence that pre-reading instruction actually led to more attention and noticing than reading only. So what we kind of concluded from this study was that the amount of attention was similar, but probably reflected different, but equally effortful processes. So the amount of attention reflected in eye movements was the same at that initial encounter in the text, regardless of whether people had seen those words before in the vocabulary activities or not. So we said, okay, in terms of amount of attention is the same, probably the differences are reflected in, what exactly was happening, those underlying processes. We didn't find evidence, as hypothesized at the beginning by other researchers, that pre-reading instruction discouraged guessing strategies, because we didn't find an initial, difference or, less attention in the case of pre-reading instruction. So the differences across conditions, we've seen that it started to disappear earlier for L1 speakers than for L2 speakers. So that increased familiarity with the novel items, it seems to be faster for L1 speakers. So L2 speakers seem to need a little bit more time to read those novel items in a similar manner to words that they know very well. And we've seen a kind of evidence for a potential processing advantage of the pre-reading instruction at the 8th encounter for L2 learners. So it could be interpreted as a reflection of both fast lexical access and also word-to-text integration. So something that may happen later on in the process of reading. So in terms of the relationship, we also found that longer reading times on target items predict meaning recognition scores, and this is in line with what other studies have reported. But they were not a predictor of meaning recall or form recognition. And this is also in line with what other studies have reported, actually finding no relationship between online processing and gains. So, again, this points to the need to conduct more research in this area and really looking at this relationship between attention and learning gains. So, of course, there were important limitations of these studies. So first, the findings were limited to a particular type of lexical item and a particular type of vocabulary learning where we have new words linked to concepts that we already know. And obviously, vocabulary gains were only measured in immediate testing conditions. So, we need to consider that how durable these gains were is not something that we can really guess from these. We can really gain from this data. So In general, we saw that, okay, there was no evidence that pre-reading instruction led to more attention. And this was something that had been already reported in the context of learning from viewing in a study by Montero Perez in 2019. So it wasn't that surprising, or at least it was in line with that other evidence that we had. But of course, we knew that because of the design that we had used, frequency was a potentially confounding factor in the study. We wanted it this way because this is, you know, the kind of conditions that we wanted to explore, but we couldn't rule out that possibility. And we consider that as a potential explanation for some of the findings that we reported. So we're going to see that in a minute. So in the reading only condition, participants were exposed to the pseudo words 8 times in the text, reading baseline the same. Instruction only, there were 2 occurrences only in the activities, but in the pre-reading instruction condition, obviously there were more exposures. So participants were exposed to the pseudo words in the first 2 activities, but then there were another 8 extra exposures. So overall, there were more exposures in this condition. There were 10 exposures in this condition, which obviously explains its advantage in terms of vocabulary gains. And this is what we wanted to do. So it was ecologically valid in that sense, because it allowed us to basically see whether those extra exposures in reading, in the pre-reading instruction condition, actually added up to what we would get from the only explicit instruction or only the reading only condition. So in terms of the aims of the study, this is what we wanted to do. But of course, there was a clear effect. The frequency and number of exposure was a confounding factor in the design. So this is really what led us to this second reanalysis that we reported in this brief report in TESOL Quarterly. So in the study that I've just discussed, what we compared was, of course, the first time that participants in all conditions were reading these words in the text, right? And that was the first overall occurrence for the reading only condition and the control condition, but it was the third occurrence for the pre-reading instruction condition, right? So they had already seen it twice in the 2 activities that they had completed. So we thought, well, maybe it would be one way of controlling for the potential factor of, potential effect of frequency is to actually compare the matched third occurrence. So if we look at how words were processed, the third time they were seen in the text in the reading only and control condition, we could compare that with the first occurrence in the text in the pre-reading instruction condition, which was overall the third time participants were seeing the words. So it was a way of, not perfect, as we'll see in a minute, but it was a way of trying to control for the potential effect of frequencies. So we decided to see, okay, let's focus on that initial occurrence and let's compare what we did in the previous study. So the first occurrence in the text in the 3 conditions, which was the third for the pre-reading instruction condition. So there was a confounding issue there with number of encounters, with the third occurrence for all the conditions. So what we call the matched third occurrence. So the aim of this reanalysis was to examine again the effect of pre-reading instruction on the initial attention allocation to target vocabulary in reading, while trying to control for frequency of exposure. So it was the same data set, so we didn't collect any new data, as you've seen in the paper. The data was analyzed also using R, linear mixed effects models were fit. And as I was saying, we basically compared what we did in the first study, those first occurrences in reading, which was confounded by frequency, with third occurrences, the match third occurrences for all for the 3 conditions. So I've realized that the graphs didn't appear, they were not complete in the paper. So yeah, I was really annoyed when I saw that. It's like, how could nobody noticed that? Anyway, so here you have the complete figures. yeah, for some reason, the reading only condition didn't appear in the printed version. Anyway, so here we have the complete figures. So basically what we saw, so on the left, you have the comparison of the first occurrence, basically what we reported in the previous study. And we see that the first time that the three groups saw saw the target items in the text, we see that the processing patterns of the pre-reading instruction condition and reading only were very similar. But when we look at the third match occurrence, which is what we have on the right, we see that the differences between pre-reading instruction and reading only were much more pronounced. And actually, the model showed that this difference was significant when we look at the third match occurrence. So that was interesting because that showed that actually there was a significant effect of pre-reading instruction on the initial processing of vocabulary. So with these new analysis, we could see that there was increased attention on those words in the pre-reading instruction conditions, something we hadn't seen in the previous study. So it kind of confirmed that pre-reading instruction is indeed an attention raising and awareness raising technique. So pre-reading instruction based on this reanalysis seems to lead to increased attention when frequency of exposure is controlled for. And of course, this means that the advantage of pre-reading instruction for vocabulary learning that we reported in the initial study could be attributed to increased attention during reading. So that was interesting, and I think it kind of contributed to our understanding of how pre-reading instruction kind of supports vocabulary learning and how it affects processing of novel words in reading. Of course, there are always limitations on more future directions. So the two things that still bother me, and I'm sure you were thinking about that when reading this paper. So with this reanalysis, we explore one way of controlling for frequency of exposure, the potential confounding factor of the frequency of exposure. But there were two things that, as I was saying, that I would like to explore further. So first of all, the exposures during the explicit condition, during the explicit instruction before the reading, were considered as two exposures, basically because there were two activities. Remember, there was the list where they had to memorize the words and the definitions, and then the matching activity. So we consider that as two exposures, but actually, there could have been more for some of the participants. So it could have been that some of the participants actually turned the page and check the definitions again, or tried again the matching activity. So this is a limitation that we could really tell of basically most vocabulary learning studies, because you create a condition and what they actually do might be something different. But I think that something that we could do to actually control for this is actually record eye movements during the instruction phase as well, and I'm aware of studies that have started to do that. So that's certainly something to consider. The two exposures in the pre-reading instruction condition were counted as two, but it's probably, or it's likely that for some of the learners there were more than two. How to count those initial exposures is a little bit tricky. And the other most important limitation or issue that I think should be addressed is that, okay, with this new analysis, we kind of control for the number of exposures. The number of exposures are equal, so we are controlling for frequency of exposure, but the types of exposure and the nature of those exposures is actually different. So we are not really looking at initial reading in the three conditions. So in the pre-reading instruction condition, that overall third occurrence was at the beginning of the story, whereas in the other two conditions, that initial matched third exposure was in a different context. And we all know how context actually affects processing patterns, and how, contextual cues or even the development of the narrative and what was going on, that could also actually affect processing patterns as well. So we might, we could, this is almost me thinking aloud, but we couldn't think of a design where, we try to do both things. Again, it would never be perfect. And we know that it's, very rarely the case that you have a perfect methodology, but it would be interesting to perhaps add another condition which is also a reading only condition, where participants are exposed 2 times to these novel pseudo words, but maybe in a non-defining sentence context. So they don't get really information about the meaning, but they're actually exposed to those forms 2 times in a pre-reading exposure. And then they actually see those pseudo words again in various encounters in the reading text. So if we were comparing these, actually, we would be controlling for frequency, because it would be the overall 3rd exposure for everyone, but it would still be the first exposure in the reading text, in the narrative. And, again, not a perfect solution, but it would be maybe something that we could do to try to, control for frequency of exposure in another way, while kind of ensuring that the type of exposure is also that we are comparing, it's also comparable. So to finish, a kind of general conclusion, we've seen from these 2 studies, when we put them together, that, okay, pre-reading instruction leads to larger vocabulary gain. So that confirms what we thought and what has been claimed in previous studies. It also seems to lead to initial increased attention when frequency of exposure is controlled for, as we've seen in this secondary analysis. But again, something to explore further. And it also seems to lead, based on the initial analysis, to an advantage in processing times after several exposures. So I think overall what these studies have shown is really the potential of eye tracking to investigate the effect of methods of constructed salience as pre-reading instruction on attention to novel lexical items. So it really is with this combination of methods that we can begin to understand how we explain that advantage of this instructional intervention and what's going on when participants and learners are processing these items under these conditions. So I hope that's what these 2 readings and these 2 studies have shown. And I believe there is now time for questions and discussion. So yeah, thank you very much for listening and being there.